Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the dim, flickering glow of a Victorian bedroom. The candlelight trembles against the wallpaper, casting long, uneasy shadows while the air feels heavy, thick with coal smoke. The faint sweetness of lavender water splashed on the pillow and the sharp, metallic tang of a gas lamp that refuses to die down. You slip under the weight of a four-poster canopy, but instead of sinking into rest, you find yourself restless, every tick of the brass mantel clock reminding you just how far sleep is. Victorians knew this feeling well. They wrestled with the same sleepless nights you do, except their cures often strayed from soothing remedies into bizarre experiments you probably wouldn't survive today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me, where are you watching from tonight and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The truth is, Victorian insomnia wasn't just a medical complaint, it was a cultural obsession. Bedrooms far from minimal were cluttered sanctuaries filled with towering wardrobes, embroidered chairs, and thick velvet curtains that trapped both heat and anxiety. Some swore the room's arrangement was the problem, the bed too close to a draft or not aligned with the mysterious magnetic currents believed to govern health. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or the clumsy birth of environmental sleep science. Either way, imagine lying awake trying to convince yourself that shifting the bed eastward might be the difference between torment and rest. Even the very act of falling asleep carried moral weight. Doctors and preachers warned that if you lay awake, perhaps your conscience wasn't clean enough. In that candlelit silence, you might ask yourself, not only, why can't I sleep, but also, what's wrong with me as a person? No pressure, right? Of course, there were practical worries too. The fire in the hearth, still smouldering after midnight, could spark a blaze at any moment. A single overturned candle might turn rest into disaster. You might find yourself drifting off, not to dreams, but to the nagging thought of whether the chimney had been properly swept. The mind, already anxious, refused to switch off. Some turned to rituals, folding nightclothes with military precision, reciting scripture, or trying to match their breathing to the steady tick of a clock. One odd trick involved counting the knots in the wooden posts of the bed until drowsiness set in. You picture a weary figure whispering 32, 33 in the dark, bargaining with their brain for silence. Quirky as these habits sound, the desperation behind them is familiar. You can almost feel the kinship, that shared moment of lying in bed, eyes wide open, bargaining with your body for rest that refuses to come. The Victorians wanted sleep, just you're still lying there, restless, and your gaze drifts toward the small table beside the bed. On it rests a ceramic teacup, steam curling up in delicate wisps. The liquid inside is not your modern chamomile or mint, but something heavier, darker, and slightly bitter. This is one of the most common Victorian solutions to sleeplessness, a brew of warm ale or poppy-infused tea. And yes, you're about to sip something that feels more like a gamble than a guaranteed lullaby. The first taste is oddly comforting, the warmth spreading through your chest, dulling the edges of thought. For Victorians, ale was considered nourishing, practically medicinal, especially if warmed before bed. The idea was that a gentle buzz might loosen the knots of anxiety and guide the mind towards softer dreams. It wasn't exactly a doctor's prescription, more a family tradition whispered down from grandmother to mother to child. You can imagine someone insisting, "It worked for my father, it'll work for you." Historians still argue whether these so-called home brews had any real pharmacological benefit, or whether it was simply the ritual, the placebo, that made weary minds believe they were drifting off. Then comes the poppy. Mixed into tea, sometimes boiled into syrup, opium's gentler cousin was often slipped into evening cups. A small dose promised to quiet the nerves and hush the restless body, and for many it did. But as you sip, you know the danger. The line between soothing and stupefying was perilously thin. Victorians didn't measure with precision scales or dosage charts. They eyeballed it, one spoonful for a child, perhaps two for an adult. You probably wouldn't survive that kind of guesswork tonight. The ritual of drinking before bed was wrapped in comfort. Families gathered around dim tables sipping their chosen brew while sharing the day's last words. The warmth of the liquid, the flicker of the fire, the sound of rain on window panes, it created a cocoon, a slow unwinding of the body. But behind that cozy picture, the risk of addiction dependence and long nights blurred into haze. You can almost hear the quiet warning of a doctor in the distance, urging restraint, but the temptation to drink just a little more often won. There were other odd ingredients too. Milk boiled with nutmeg. Syrups flavored with lettuce believed to carry a natural sedative. Even vinegar-laced mixtures where the sharp tang supposedly reset the body's rhythm. Imagine the trial and error. One night you're soothed by creamy warmth, the next you're choking down something that tastes like salad dressing gone wrong. And yet people swore by these concoctions, passing down recipes like treasured heirlooms. One quirky tidbit: some households recommended soaking bread in ale, then eating it slowly before bed. The heavy starch plus alcohol was said to anchor the body into sleep. You picture yourself chewing soggy crusts in candlelight, trying to convince your stomach that heaviness equals rest. It's not glamorous, but it was comfort food for the sleepless. The irony is that while Victorians clung to these nightcaps, physicians of the time were deeply divided. Some insisted that alcohol and poppy-based teas were essential tools against sleeplessness. Others scolded them as reckless warning that drowsiness bought in this way was counterfeit, a mask over deeper nervous disorders. And as usual, historians still argue whether these household remedies did more harm than good, or whether the harm was simply invisible in the moment, only surfacing years later as dependence or illness. And yet there's something strangely familiar here, isn't there? You think of modern bedtime teas lined up in kitchen cupboards marketed with names like Sleepy Time or Dream Blend. Maybe we've just replaced poppy syrup with chamomile bags and given the same old ritual a safer face. The instinct is timeless: to sip something warm, to let the liquid signal the brain that the day is over. As you set down the cup, the warmth lingers, but so does the unease. Because for Victorians, when the tea or ale failed, the next step wasn't gentler, it was a descent into heavier cures and sometimes into full-blown dependence on the strongest substances the age had to offer. The warmth of the ale lingers in your stomach, but the night presses on. You roll onto your side, the bed creaking beneath you, and your eyes travel over the furniture that surrounds you. This bedroom feels more like a stage set than a sanctuary. The carved oak wardrobe looming in the corner, the embroidered chair draped with clothing, and the bed itself an architectural statement. Victorians believed the very furniture you slept on shaped your chances of drifting into rest. Your mattress is thick with feathers, the kind that swallows you whole when you lie back. For some, this softness was paradise. For others, it was suffocating, as if sinking too deeply would prevent the lungs from filling. Doctors of the period debated, constantly, was a firm horsehair mattress healthier than a featherbed? Should sleepers be elevated slightly or lie flat as the grave? Historians still argue whether these debates were rooted in genuine medical theory or simply fashion disguised as science. Beside you is an iron bedstead painted white but chipped cold to the touch. Unlike wood iron, was praised as hygienic, no hidden bugs, no lurking disease. But there's a clinical chill about it. Imagine placing your cheek against the icy bars in winter or hearing them clatter every time you shifted. Still, Victorians clung to iron as progress, the Industrial Revolution, brought right into the bedroom. And then there were pillows. Not one or two, but sometimes towers of them, each designed to adjust posture. Some guides suggested propping the head at a precise angle to ensure airflow. Others demanded a flat position for proper spinal alignment. If you couldn't sleep, the blame might fall not on your thoughts, but on the way your pillow cradled your neck. You find yourself experimenting, turning this way and that, chasing the phantom of perfect support. The bedroom layout itself became ritualized. Some households insisted the bed must face east to catch the morning sun. Others claimed sleeping north-south aligned the body with magnetic fields. And if you happened to wake often in the night, perhaps it was because your bed was placed against the wrong wall. One fringe recommendation even warned against mirrors near the bed, claiming they reflected restless energy back at the sleeper. You glance at the gilt-framed glass across the room and wonder if your reflection is keeping watch long after you've closed your eyes. Even noise was part of the equation. Rural houses relied on silence, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the creak of timbers. City dwellers, though, fought with clatter. Horses on cobblestones, the hiss of gas pipes, or the clanging of midnight bells could unravel fragile sleep. To cope, some people stuffed rags beneath doors, hung heavy curtains, or even stuffed cotton in their ears. A quirky tidbit, one household manual advised placing a ticking clock near the bed, not to disturb but to soothe its steady rhythm, acting as a lullaby. You test the idea, letting the tick-tock beat against your ears, but instead of calm, it reminds you of time slipping by. Furniture also carried moral weight. A tidy room was seen as an aid to sleep disorder, as a symptom of weak character. Imagine a stern housekeeper lecturing, "How can you expect peaceful slumber when your stockings are flung over the chair?" You laugh softly to yourself. Even your cluttered nightstand would have drawn disapproving stares. Yet for all these efforts, iron bedsteads, perfectly angled pillows, east-facing rooms, insomnia persisted. The Victorians might have rearranged furniture endlessly, but when shadows still danced across the ceiling, they needed heavier artillery. And that's when they reached for a bottle that promised dreams but often delivered something far darker. The mattress shifts beneath you, but no arrangement of feathers or pillows seems to hush the churn of your thoughts. And then you notice the small glass bottle glinting faintly in the candlelight. It's laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol, the Victorian darling of the medicine cabinet, the all-purpose cure that soothed coughs, eased pain, and yes, promised to knock you out cold. You uncork the bottle, and the sharp medicinal scent rises. A teaspoon, sometimes, less often more, was the standard bedtime dose. Mothers gave it to teething infants, labourers drank it after grueling shifts, and insomniacs tipped it down like liquid salvation. For many it worked, the heavy warmth spreading through the veins, a velvet darkness settling over the mind. For others, it was the start of a lifelong tether. You know the danger. This wasn't a harmless sleep aid, but a narcotic masquerading as household necessity. And yet, in its own way, laudanum became part of the cultural fabric. Writers praised its ability to unlock creativity. Poets drifted into dreamscapes that spilled onto the page. A restless Victorian might whisper, "Just a drop more," believing that somewhere between sobriety and stupor lay the perfect slumber. Historians still argue whether its popularity came from genuine relief or simply from the addictive pull that kept bottles emptying faster than they could be replaced. There's a surreal intimacy in imagining families passing around the bottle. A mother dosing herself after rocking her child to sleep. A father sipping before bed to hush the echoes of factory whistles. Even respectable ladies tucked in lace nightdresses reached for it, justifying it as medicinal, never indulgent. Quirky fact, some pharmacies even flavoured laudanum with spices cinnamon clove to make the bitter concoction more palatable, turning narcotics into something close to a nightcap. You feel the tug of irony. Insomnia, a condition of too much thinking, was treated by a substance that erased thought entirely. And yet the sleepless clung to it even as doctors began to mutter warnings of laudanum habits. Moralists raged, pamphlets circulated, but the bottle still glimmered in almost every home. It was the hush button on a noisy age. The debate was endless. Some physicians insisted small doses were harmless, no more dangerous than a glass of sherry. Others argued that laudanum was the very reason nervous disorders seemed to multiply. You can almost hear two doctors quarrelling at a gentleman's club. "Sir, it brings relief. No, sir, it brings ruin." The truth, as you suspect, lay somewhere in between, but countless Victorians were too weary to care. Imagine, too, the creative class. Famous authors scribbling by candlelight, laudanum at hand, their works infused with the strange half-dream of narcotic sleep. One wonders, were their masterpieces born of insomnia or of the haze that followed their cure? Historians still argue whether laudanum was a muse or a thief. The quiet danger, of course, was dependence. What began as a teaspoon before bed became 2, then 3, until the line between waking and dreaming blurred. And for some, the dreams never came at all, only the numb fog of a body that couldn't find natural rest anymore. You can sense the weight of it now, the desperation that drove people, not just to warm ale or feather pillows, but to swallow the strongest medicine of the age. And yet even with laudanum, many still found themselves staring at the ceiling, mind-buzzing, heart-racing. For them, the answer was not in bottles, but in contraptions, strange machines that ticked, hummed, or jolted the body into surrender. The little laudanum bottle sits half empty on the nightstand, its promise of oblivion fading as the night stretches long. Your ears catch something else now, a mechanical whir, a faint metallic tick that doesn't belong to the clock. You glance across the room, and there it is, one of the strangest Victorian inventions meant to chase insomnia away, part machine, part menace. The age of steam and steel loved its contraptions, and sleep was no exception. Some devices resembled oversized alarm clocks designed not to wake you in the morning, but to lull you into night. One strange machine released a soft, ticking, a steady rhythm meant to hypnotize the restless mind. The idea was that much like a metronome, the sound would pace your breathing and coax you into slumber. Historians still argue whether these ticking cures were genuinely calming or whether they only drove the sleepless mad. Others went further. Imagine lying in bed as a contraption placed beneath the mattress begins to rock it, gently simulating the sway of a cradle. For some, the motion was soothing. For others, it was seasickness in the dark. You picture yourself clinging to the sheets, half dizzy, hoping unconsciousness arrives before nausea does. One particularly quirky invention involved an automated pillow shaker. The device, wound up with clockwork gears, jolted the head just enough to supposedly interrupt anxious thoughts. The theory was simple: by startling the mind, it would reset into a calmer state. In practice, you'd probably spend the night waiting for the next rude bump. Still, advertisements bragged of restful repose through mechanical genius. Victorians also experimented with soundscapes. Some households used tiny music boxes that played endlessly, their delicate melodies filling the room. Others invested in tuning forks or small resonating machines, the vibrations thought to harmonize the nervous system. There's something oddly modern in this, almost like the white noise machines and sleep apps we plug in today. Perhaps the hum of industry never left us, we just made it portable. But not every invention was gentle. Some contraptions were designed to force sleep by sheer exhaustion. One consisted of a chair that rocked violently if you leaned back too far, a bizarre punishment that trained the body to sit straight until it collapsed in fatigue. Another device, more cruel, used cold water dripped rhythmically onto the forehead, a kind of inverted torture where irritation would supposedly drive you into slumber once the dripping stopped. You can almost hear yourself muttering, or just never sleep again. Despite their absurdity, these machines had a serious market. The Victorians were in love with technology, convinced that anything mechanical could solve the mysteries of the human body. If steam could drive trains across continents, why couldn't gears and springs guide the brain into rest? And yet, as you glance back at the whirring device in the corner, you suspect it kept more people awake with curiosity or terror than it ever soothed into dreams. Doctors, too, were divided. Some praised mechanical therapies as the dawn of scientific sleep medicine. Others ridiculed them as noisy gimmicks preying on the desperate. One medical journal of the time dismissed them as novelties for the drawing room, suggesting they belonged alongside magic lanterns and parlor tricks. Historians still argue whether these machines were serious medical attempts or simply a side business of restless inventors. But what lingers most is the image of a weary Victorian winding up a strange device at midnight, clinging to hope that this time the gears would deliver peace. And when the machines failed, as they so often did, the next step was colder, sharper, and far less forgiving. Because if the body refused to rest, Victorians thought perhaps they could shock it into submission with plunges into icy water. The last tick of the machine winds down, leaving you in a room that hums with silence again. But your body, jittery from the experiment, still refuses to surrender. That's when the servant enters with a brass basin, steam curling faintly above it. You lean closer, expecting something warm and soothing. But no, this is the dreaded cold bath, the Victorian answer to nerves, sleeplessness, and just about anything else the age couldn't quite explain. You dip your hand in first. The water bites sharp as winter air, and your skin recoils instantly. Imagine being told that plunging into this icy pool right before bed was supposed to calm you. The theory was rooted in hydropathy, or the water cure, wildly fashionable in the 19th century. Doctors claimed that cold water shocked the nervous system into balance, slowed racing thoughts, and forced the body into a kind of restorative stillness. Historians still argue whether these claims had any merit or if the supposed calm was simply numbness disguised as serenity. The practice varied. Some households filled a tin tub in the bedroom, the bather dunking themselves before climbing into bed shivering. Others recommended a brisk splash at the washstand, face, neck, wrists, like a soldier's ritual before sleep. And in the more extreme water cure spas, patients were fully submerged in icy baths, sometimes restrained under blankets soaked in frigid liquid, the treatment lasting for hours. You probably wouldn't survive that kind of bedtime therapy without catching a chill that lingered longer than your insomnia. Yet Victorians swore by it. Diaries speak of nerves soothed by the refreshing shock letters praising the calm of the body after the water. One quirky tidbit: some manuals suggested that if you couldn't afford a proper tub, you should simply soak your feet in cold water before bed, believing the chill would draw excess energy downward away from the restless brain. You imagine a row of weary Londoners' ankles plunged in buckets, sighing with exaggerated relief. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some doctors insisted cold bathing invigorated rather than relaxed, waking the body instead of soothing it. Others argued that alternating between hot and cold was the secret, a seesaw of temperatures that confused the nerves into surrender. The debates grew so heated that entire journals were devoted to the hydropathic question. Historians still argue whether water therapy was medicine pseudoscience or simply another chapter in humanity's long struggle with sleepless nights. But beyond the science or lack of it was the experience itself. Picture yourself shivering, skin tingling as you scramble into bed immediately after the plunge. The feather mattress now feels like a furnace compared to the icy shock, and your body, overwhelmed, finally surrenders into warmth. Maybe, just maybe, that contrast tricked the nervous system into drowsiness, or maybe you just passed out from sheer exhaustion. Cold baths weren't limited to the privacy of bedrooms. Wealthier Victorians travelled to hydropathic resorts, sprawling complexes in the countryside, where patients queued for douses, plunges, and wraps. Entire nights were structured around these treatments, the belief being that routine and discipline were just as important as the water itself. To wander through one of these resorts was to hear the shouts of the freshly dunked, followed by the hushed snores of those who claimed it worked. Still, one can't help but smirk. You think of modern sleep advice, warm showers, cozy pajamas, weighted blankets. Then you compare it to a Victorian shivering in icy water at midnight. It's a reminder that people have always been willing to endure discomfort, even misery, in pursuit of sleep. And if you thought the cold was bad, wait until you see the next great debate of the Victorian night, whether the very air you breathed should be sealed away behind heavy drapes or let in through wide-open windows, no matter how bitter the wind. Your skin still tingles from the imagined plunge, the shiver not quite leaving your bones. You pull the covers tight and glance toward the window, where heavy velvet drapes hang like sentries, guarding against the night. To a Victorian, those curtains weren't just decoration. They were part of a heated argument about what you should breathe while you slept. Should your bedroom be a sealed cocoon trapping every ounce of warmth, or should it be a drafty chamber open to the bracing night air, no matter the season? Many households believed in the cocoon. Heavy drapes, thick carpets, even stuffed fabric pressed against door cracks kept out drafts considered dangerous to health. Cold air was thought to invite illness to creep into lungs and breed consumption. A well-to-do family might proudly show you a bedroom with curtains so thick they blocked even the sound of the street below. Imagine lying in such a room, still airless, every breath growing heavier. The air feels close, like breathing through wool. Yet Victorians insisted this stifling comfort was protection. Others, though, took the opposite stance. Fresh air was medicine. Windows were flung open. Even in winter, the sleeper bundled under layers of blankets while icy wind rattled the panes. Proponents argued that bad air, what they called miasma, poisoned the mind and body. Better to risk a chill than to marinate in stale atmosphere. You picture yourself tucked beneath quilts, nose poking out into frosty currents, debating whether clean air is worth frostbitten toes. This wasn't just idle preference, it was war. Medical journals clashed with household manuals, neighbors judged one another, and even families split. One quirky tidbit: some Victorians installed contraptions that allowed a controlled trickle of outside air into sealed rooms, tiny vents disguised as part of the wall. It was the 19th century version of an air purifier, minus the electricity. Historians still argue whether these compromises made any measurable difference, or whether they just satisfied the psychological need to do something about the night air. The debate stretched beyond health into morality. A sealed room symbolized respectability, a home well-ordered, guarded against the chaos outside. An open window hinted at lax discipline, a willingness to expose the family to danger. Sleep once again became a test of character. Were you cautious and proper, or daring and reckless with your lungs? And then there was smell. Coal smoke, horse manure, and industrial fumes drifted through open windows in the city. Imagine trying to rest with the stench of tanneries or breweries seeping into your pillow. In those cases, sealing the windows wasn't just about warmth, but about sanity. Rural Victorians, meanwhile, revelled in night breezes carrying hay pine or sea salt, convinced these scents healed the nerves. You can almost smell the difference yourself, choking smoke versus crisp meadow air. The paradox was cruel. Too much sealing and you risk suffocation. Too much openness and you invite cold and disease. And all the while the insomniac lay awake, wondering if their sleeplessness came from stale air or fresh. You can picture them tugging at curtains in the night, torn between two philosophies desperate for relief. The irony: modern science does suggest cooler rooms help sleep, but not icebox conditions, and certainly not the smoky stagnation of coal-fired parlours. The Victorians stumbled around the truth, but rarely grasped it fully. Historians still argue whether they were pioneers of ventilation science or simply fumbling through competing superstitions. And so you lie there in the half-opened, half-sealed room, the debate unresolved. The curtains sway, the air feels both too heavy and too sharp, and your eyes refuse to close. That's when another fashion sweeps in, not about furniture or air, but about invisible forces of the body itself. Forces that some claimed could be manipulated with magnets' hands and sheer willpower to bring rest at last. The drapes stir faintly, and you wonder whether the air is cleansing your lungs or slowly poisoning them. But then a different kind of cure drifts into the conversation, not about drafts or bedding, but about unseen energies humming through your body. Imagine a man in a frock coat leaning toward you, eyes gleaming, and announcing that your sleeplessness isn't about nerves or digestion at all. No, it's your magnetic field. Welcome to the Victorian fascination with magnetism and mesmerism. You're ushered into a parlour, the lamps low, the room heavy with anticipation. At the centre sits a polished iron rod, or perhaps a horseshoe magnet said to draw the chaotic energies from your restless body. You place your hands upon it, half skeptical, half hopeful. The inventor assures you that in minutes your nervous system will realign, your racing thoughts will quiet, and sleep will arrive. Historians still argue whether such practices were earnest medical attempts or theatrical performances meant to dazzle paying customers. But magnetism wasn't the only invisible force in fashion. Mesmerism, named after Franz Mesmer, suggested that a skilled practitioner could guide your body into slumber with nothing more than passes of the hand. You close your eyes as a mesmerist waves slowly over your forehead, murmuring gently, and you can't tell whether you're dozing off or simply bored into submission. Quirky detail: some mesmerists claimed they could send patients to sleep at a distance, projecting influence across town, a Victorian version of remote control. These sessions weren't confined to back alleys. Respectable drawing rooms played host to mesmerism demonstrations, complete with audiences watching subjects collapse into dreamy stupors. You imagine the hush as a volunteer slumps sideways in a chair, the crowd whispering about the power of unseen currents. For the sleepless, it must have seemed miraculous to hand yourself over to another's will and in return receive the gift of rest. Of course, skeptics abounded. Some doctors denounced mesmerism as fraud, accusing practitioners of exploiting vulnerable patients. Others insisted it worked, though not because of mysterious energy, but because of suggestion, what we now call hypnosis. Historians still argue whether mesmerism should be remembered as quackery or as the accidental birth of psychological therapy. The appeal, though, was undeniable. When you've spent night after night staring at the ceiling, wouldn't you grasp at the chance that a magnet or a stranger's hand could coax you into unconsciousness? Some even reported extraordinary dreams under mesmerism journeys of the mind that felt more vivid than waking life. You wonder if those dreamscapes were worth the risk of surrendering control. And then, as often happens in the Victorian night fashion, turned profit. Merchants sold magnetic mattresses, rods and trinkets, each promising better rest. Pamphlets shouted claims insomnia banished, nerves restored. The devices glittered in shop windows as alluring as any bottle of laudanum. One eccentric invention even embedded magnets in pillows, so your very dreams could be aligned. You picture yourself laying your head down, half amused, half hopeful, wondering if a magnet under your ear is the secret to peace. But, whether mesmerized or magnetized, many Victorians awoke the same as before, tired, fretful, still bargaining with the night. And when invisible forces failed, they returned to something far more tangible, the burn of strong spirits, the heavy lull of alcohol. The mesmerist's hands withdraw, the magnets lose their imagined pull, and you are left blinking in the half-dark, no closer to rest. Then your gaze falls again to the bedside table, where glass bottles gleam dark amber green, tinted, their contents far more familiar than any invisible force. This is the realm of the Victorian nightcap, where brandy, whiskey and fortified wines promised the mercy of sleep when gentler methods failed. You take a sip, the burn of brandy cutting sharp across your tongue before sinking warmly into your chest. For centuries, alcohol had been the world's simplest sedative, and Victorians embraced it with gusto. A glass of port, a dram of whiskey, even stout ale before bed, all were touted as respectable ways to steady the nerves. Doctors recommended it in moderation, while household guides described it as a remedy for those troubled by late wakefulness. Historians still argue whether alcohol was genuinely endorsed by science or simply tolerated because it was already so woven into daily life. The ritual itself was comforting. Picture a weary clerk setting down his ledger, pouring a generous measure into a cut-glass tumbler and sighing as the day dissolved in liquid fire, or a lady in lace quietly sipping sherry under the guise of medicine. In grand homes, silver trays bore nightcaps upstairs, a final indulgence before lights went out. You can almost hear the clink of glass against glass as couples toasted to dreams they hoped would come quickly. Yet the line between cure and curse was razor thin. Alcohol could dull anxious thoughts, yes, but it rarely guaranteed true rest. More often it splintered sleep into fragments, leaving the drinker groggy and irritable by morning. Still, desperation outweighed caution. One quirky tidbit: some Victorians even mixed alcohol with milk or eggs, believing the richness grounded the spirit while the alcohol soothed it. You picture yourself forcing down a frothy brandy and egg concoction, wondering if the stomachache would outlast the insomnia. Doctors themselves couldn't agree. Some swore by a little brandy at bedtime, while others condemned it as the root of society's nervous troubles. Medical journals warned that dependency was growing, but public demand didn't falter. Taverns and apothecaries alike profited, and the sleepless justified their habits with the simple refrain, "It helps me sleep." And let's not forget the darker underbelly. For those already relying on laudanum, alcohol was often its companion. A few sips of brandy to enhance the effect, or wine to wash down a spoonful of opium syrup. The mixture was as common as it was dangerous. You can't help but wince at the thought your midnight cocktail might have been a recipe for dreams you never woke from. Still, there was a psychological comfort here, something timeless. Even today, many reach for a glass of wine to wind down, repeating the same ritual Victorians practiced under gaslight. Perhaps it's less about the chemical effect than the message to the brain: the day is done, rest is near. The taste becomes a lullaby, the warmth a kind of promise. But when the bottle's emptied and the headache replaced the calm, Victorians turned inward. They began to ask whether sleep could be summoned not by potions or contraptions, but by discipline, by reshaping habits, by crafting what we now call sleep hygiene. The brandy glass stands empty, its comfort fading faster than you'd hoped. The room feels heavy again, and you realize the Victorians eventually faced the same truth. No matter how many potions or devices you swallow, the body has rhythms of its own. So they began to speak of discipline, of order of sleep, as something you could train into obedience, if only you lived properly. You imagine yourself in a parlor, a doctor in stiff collar lecturing you not about drugs but about habits. Avoid excitement before bed, he declares, wagging a finger. No novels with cliffhangers, no heated debates, no dancing until midnight. Your mind must be calm, unruffled like still water. Even music came under suspicion. A lively piano piece could stimulate the nerves, while gentle hymns were thought to soothe. Historians still argue whether these recommendations reflect genuine observation or just Victorian obsession with self-control. Daily routine became a prescription. Rise at the same hour, retire at the same hour, eat meals punctually. If you wandered from the schedule, sleeplessness was seen as your own fault, a punishment for laxity. One quirky tidbit: some guides even advised against reading poetry in the evening, claiming that the imagination it stirred would haunt the mind through the night. You can almost laugh. Imagine tossing at 2 a.m. because Keats was too evocative. Diet too played its part. Heavy suppers of meat and puddings were scolded as enemies of rest. Instead, light fare, porridge, milk bread was recommended. Exercise was encouraged, though not too close to bedtime. A brisk walk in the fading light, doctors said, would settle digestion and temper the nerves. You picture yourself pacing a cobblestone street, gas lamps flickering, trying to walk your way into oblivion. And then there was the bed itself. Manuals instructed on firmness, cleanliness, and position. Too soft and the body sagged into unrest. Too hard and the bones ached. Feather mattresses fell from favor, accused of trapping heat and stifling breath. Plain horsehair or firm springs were better, accompanied by crisp linen, changed often. The bed became not just furniture, but a moral statement: disciplined, orderly, hygienic. Yet for all this advice, insomnia persisted. The Victorians grew stricter, convinced that sleeplessness reflected weakness of character. Couldn't sleep? Then you must have overindulged, overstimulated, or failed to control your thoughts. Sleep was no longer a natural state to be coaxed. It was a test of virtue. You imagine lying there, heart racing, and instead of sympathy, you're told it's your fault for eating too much cake. Some tried to systematize relaxation, writing entire treatises on the art of sleep. Instructions detailed how to position the body, what to think about, even how to count breaths. Counting sheep, though ancient, gained new life in Victorian parlours, praised as a method of focusing the mind. Did it work? Perhaps, though many insomniacs no doubt found themselves stuck at sheep number 4, 8, 12. Historians still argue whether this discipline was early psychology or simply moral policing disguised as medicine. Either way, it reveals the shift. Insomnia became less about bad air or bad luck and more about bad habits. Sleep hygiene, as we now call it, was born. But for those whose habits failed, whose minds still buzzed, despite every effort, there remained one last option: long journeys into countryside retreats where doctors promised that nature itself would restore what city life had stolen. You step away from the regimented schedules and stern lectures, and suddenly the walls of the city dissolve into rolling fields. The air smells fresher, the horizon opens wide, and you find yourself swept into the Victorian belief that the countryside itself could mend the sleepless soul. After all, if gaslight, smoke and noise poisoned the night, then perhaps the cure was simply to escape them. Rest cures and health retreats sprouted across Europe and America, offering weary insomniacs a new kind of hope. Imagine boarding a train, leaving behind the clatter of London or Manchester, and arriving at a sprawling sanatorium nestled among pine forests. White pillared verandas gleam in the sun, promising purity. Inside, attendants whisper about the restorative power of nature. You're assigned a simple room, sparse but clean, where the windows are thrown wide for fresh air. The prescription is clear: walk gently in the gardens, drink mineral water, bathe in cold springs, and above all, sleep in harmony with the rhythms of the countryside. Historians still argue whether these retreats offered genuine health benefits or merely expensive vacations for the wealthy. But there's no denying the appeal of trading city smog for birdsong. Some establishments leaned heavily on spa culture. You'd sip sulphurous water, pungent and earthy, while attendants swore it would cleanse your blood. Others prescribed long periods of silence, broken only by measured meals and early bedtimes. The routine itself was therapy: breakfast, at dawn walks before noon, reading only gentle books and always no stimulants. One quirky tidbit: certain retreats required patients to avoid not just alcohol and tobacco, but also conversation after dark, claiming that words stirred the brain and delayed rest. You picture yourself lying in bed, desperate to whisper something funny to the roommate across the hall, but silenced by the threat of expulsion. Of course, there was a darker side. The rest cure, popularized by physicians like Silas Weir Mitchell, often confined patients to bed for weeks, restricting activity to force relaxation. For women especially, this could mean isolation, inactivity, and endless monotony. Some described the treatment as soothing, others as psychological torment. Charlotte Perkins. Gilman's famous story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was a haunting critique, suggesting that enforced rest might drive one closer to madness than sleep. And yet the countryside retreats boomed. Railways made them accessible, newspapers advertised their marvels, and testimonials flowed from grateful visitors. You imagine yourself returning to the city months later, tanned, calm, boasting of nights as deep as the forest itself. Whether placebo or not, the ritual of escape gave meaning to insomnia. It wasn't just an ailment, but a condition worthy of pilgrimage. But for those who couldn't afford such luxuries, who lay awake in cramped tenements or noisy boarding houses, there was little solace in spa towns. For them, sleep would remain a nightly gamble, a battle fought with whatever remedies were at hand. And so the Victorian night drew toward its close, carrying with it both the grand hopes of countryside cures and the lingering despair of ordinary insomnia. But the century wasn't quite finished experimenting, because the very march of modern technology, so often blamed for sleeplessness, soon offered its own dazzling solutions. You return from the countryside refreshed, or perhaps merely bored, of mineral water, and find the city alive with a new kind of promise. The Victorian age was nothing if not intoxicated with invention, and soon insomnia itself became another problem for engineers and entrepreneurs to solve. If magnets and mesmerists hadn't lulled you, perhaps electricity, gas and machinery might. After all, why rely on moonlight when Edison had bottled the sun? Gaslight first extended the evening, then electric bulbs banished night entirely. The city shimmered in golden glow, factories hummed past midnight, and homes no longer surrendered to darkness. Ironically, the very technology that fueled sleeplessness also inspired cures. Inventors hawked contraptions designed to harness currents and vibrations, insisting they could coax the nervous system into slumber. Historians still argue whether these devices were proto-scientific breakthroughs or pure snake oil. Picture one such gadget: a helmet wired with small electrodes, humming faintly as you strap it to your temples. A gentle buzz prickles across your scalp, advertised as soothing stimulation. In truth, the sensation probably startled more than it calmed. Yet advertisements boasted of miraculous results guaranteed to induce healthy, natural repose. You imagine lying there, head tingling, wondering if you're being cured or lightly electrocuted. There were mechanical aids too, rocking beds that mimicked a cradle, vibrating chairs to jostle nerves into quiet, and even pulsating pillows that promised rhythmic comfort. One quirky tidbit describes a device resembling a sewing machine designed to gently shake the sleeper for restorative influence. Comforting. Perhaps not, but the Victorians adored innovation, even when it rattled their skulls. Gas inhalation was another frontier. Doctors experimented with chloroform and ether, first as surgical anesthetics, then as potential sleep aids. Patients were told to breathe deeply, surrendering to chemically induced oblivion. Some reported blissful rest, others never woke. Safety standards were far from reliable, but desperation made gamblers of many. Of course, not all technology was sinister. The ticking of factory-made clocks became a kind of lullaby for urban households, their steady rhythm offering reassurance. Early white noise came not from machines, but from the rumble of trains or the hiss of gas lamp sounds that city dwellers came to associate with comfort. Insomnia, once a silent terror, was softened by the mechanical heartbeat of modern life. Still, with every new device came both excitement and unease. Were these marvels progress, or were they merely distractions masking the deeper truth that sleep cannot be engineered? You picture yourself surrounded by wires, fumes, and gadgets, eyes still wide open. The Victorians too must have wondered whether they were solving sleeplessness or inventing new ways to suffer it. And yet the dream of a technological fix endured. Because if electricity could light the world and engines could conquer distance, then surely, just surely, a machine could grant rest. But in chasing these inventions, Victorians also revealed something profound, that insomnia was more than a medical nuisance. It had become a metaphor for the age itself, restless, ambitious, unable to stop, even when the body begged for stillness. You lie among buzzing contraptions, wires still humming faintly, and realize something important. The Victorians weren't just fighting sleeplessness, they were redefining what sleep meant in a world that never seemed to stop. For centuries, rest had been taken for granted, woven naturally into the rhythms of day and night. But in the 19th century, crowded, noisy, and relentlessly modern sleep became a battleground. Insomnia crept into novels, diaries, and medical lectures alike. Poets lamented the long, white nights of wakefulness, doctors penned thick volumes about nervous exhaustion, and ordinary people whispered in frustration about their weary eyes. To lose sleep was no longer a personal inconvenience, it was cast as a symptom of civilization itself. Historians still argue whether insomnia really increased in this era, or whether it was simply named, diagnosed, and feared more than before. You picture a coal-streaked clerk trudging home after 14 hours of labor, lying awake because wages didn't cover rent. Or a society hostess pacing her grand chamber, her mind buzzing with obligations and gossip. Sleeplessness cut across classes, but it revealed itself in different ways. Fatigue at the loom for some, midnight anxiety over reputation for others. One quirky tidbit pamphlets even described insomnia as the disease of progress, claiming that the very brilliance of Victorian culture, its art industry and science, came at the cost of broken rest. In this sense, your tossing and turning was almost a badge of honor, proof that you lived in an age too busy, too ambitious, too hungry for sleep. Doctors preached remedies, inventors sold gadgets, and authors mused on sleepless nights, but the underlying truth lingered. Insomnia reflected the tension between body and world, between the desire for stillness and the pull of endless motion. You imagine yourself stretched thin, one hand reaching for calm, the other for progress, unable to choose. And in that tension, the Victorians left us more than dubious cures. They left us questions we still ask. Is sleeplessness a personal flaw, a medical problem, or the inevitable price of modern life? Perhaps, as some argued, it was all three. Perhaps it still is. As the century waned, the battle with insomnia did not end. Instead, it seeped into the new century, carried forward in pills, devices, and anxieties we still recognize today. But before we leave the Victorians entirely, there remains the matter of their final legacy, the way their sleepless nights shaped not just medicine, but the very culture of rest. You drift forward into the late Victorian twilight, where insomnia has become more than an affliction. It is a cultural obsession. Doctors lecture on it, newspapers serialize it, and even dinner parties chatter about it. Somewhere between the snake oils and the electro-helmets, sleeplessness acquires a certain romance. To confess I could not sleep is no longer shameful, it's almost fashionable. In drawing rooms, the sleepless are pitied, yet admired. You imagine yourself reclining in a velvet chair, tea cooling in your hand while you tell friends of your long hours staring at moonlit ceilings. They nod gravely, perhaps a little envious of the mystery it lends you. After all, the great minds were sleepless, weren't they? Napoleon claimed to thrive on a few hours a night, and philosophers of the day turned insomnia into a mark of genius. Historians still argue whether Victorian culture genuinely glorified sleeplessness, or whether such tales were just convenient excuses for nervous elites. But the fact remains, diaries and novels of the time brim with nocturnal confessions. Sleep became not just a biological need, but a metaphor of purity lost, of anxieties revealed, of civilization itself teetering on the edge of exhaustion. One quirky tidbit: some fashionable households even hosted wakeful evenings gatherings where insomniacs compared remedies, recited poetry, or simply stared at flickering candles together. Imagine a support group disguised as a salon where everyone pretended their shared malady was actually a mark of refinement. Meanwhile, publishers noticed the trend. Entire books promised to solve the midnight curse, while advertisements for mattresses, teas, and tonics filled magazines. Insomnia was lucrative. You picture shopkeepers rubbing their hands together, delighted that sleeplessness was not just common, but profitable. Yet beneath the glamour lay unease. Workers could not afford to lose sleep, mothers could not neglect children, and soldiers could not march bleary-eyed. The culture that made insomnia stylish also sharpened its sting. To admit sleeplessness might win you sympathy at a salon, but in the factory it could cost your job. And so insomnia became a paradox, both fashionable and feared, romantic and ruinous, a companion of poets and a torment of laborers. You, wandering through this duality, begin to sense the deeper truth. The Victorians had transformed sleep into a cultural battleground where identity, class and progress were all negotiated. But this transformation left echoes that did not vanish with the gas lamps. Because once insomnia became a story people told about themselves, it never really faded. It followed into the modern age, reshaped but never erased. And so as we approach the final stretch of this long, drowsy journey, you begin to wonder what remains of those Victorian nights in your own restless hours today. You ease forward into the closing decades of the 19th century, where the flicker of oil lamps gives way to steady electric glow, and the restless Victorian finally begins to fade into the modern sleeper. The story of sleeplessness is not ending here, it is only shifting shape. But as the century closes, so too do many of the stranger experiments. The laudanum bottles once perched proudly on nightstands grow tarnished with suspicion. Doctors begin to whisper of addiction, of families ruined by overuse, of minds clouded instead of soothed. The brandy nightcaps too lose their glamour, replaced by medical warnings that spirits do little but blur the edges of exhaustion. The ice baths, the vibrating chairs, the helmets that tingled your scalp, all begin to seem like relics of a more credulous age. Yet some things endure. Herbal remedies, valerian chamomile hops, remain popular. Even now, they're Victorian advocates, vindicated by the persistence of those same teas in your local grocery aisle. Heavy curtains, fresh sheets, a cool bedroom, all pieces of Victorian sleep hygiene, still form the backbone of modern advice. The idea that your environment shapes your rest was not invented by sleep scientists of the 20th century. It was murmured in Victorian parlours long before. One quirky tidbit: early sleep laboratories, born at the very end of the Victorian era, still carried echoes of those strange contraptions. Electrodes, this time more carefully applied, began to record brainwaves. The dream of measuring and managing sleep, once a carnival trick, began edging toward true science. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely suffered more insomnia than their ancestors, or whether they simply documented it more obsessively. What cannot be denied is their legacy. They transformed sleeplessness from a private frustration into a cultural phenomenon. To be awake in the night was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a shared condition of modern life. And you, lying here, hear their echoes in your own restless nights. When you sip herbal tea, when you pull the curtains tight, when you scroll your glowing device at midnight, you are in some sense repeating Victorian rituals. They were the first to wrestle with a sleepless world shaped by industry light and anxiety. We are merely continuing the struggle. So the tale winds down, not with a cure, but with a recognition insomnia is not a flaw, not entirely a disease, but a mirror. It reflects the age that births it, the fears and ambitions that keep people awake. For the Victorians, that mirror showed steam engines, telegrams, gaslight, and restless ambition. For you, perhaps it shows blue light screens, deadlines, and buzzing notifications. Different century, same sleepless hum. And as the last shadows of Victorian London fade, you realize their story is still your story. Their beds creaked under heavy curtains. Yours hums with electronic glow. But the night, the longing for rest, the strange cures and desperate hopes, those are timeless. And so as we dim the gas lamp one final time, you carry their lessons forward into your own midnight hours. Now the journey softens as though the cobblestones beneath your feet give way to quiet earth, and the clamour of Victorian streets dissolves into silence. You have wandered through parlours thick with laudanum fumes, through icy baths and rattling contraptions, through gaslit nights and electric dawns. And now, gently, those echoes fade. The voices of doctors and quacks, the whispers of insomniacs and dreamers drift into a kind of hush. What remains is not the noise of their remedies, but the reminder that sleeplessness is a thread winding through human history, weaving you into the same fabric. Their nights of tossing and turning are not so distant from your own, and that recognition, strange as it may sound, is quietly comforting. You breathe slower now. The words stretch longer, softer like shadows lengthening at dusk. Imagine drawing a curtain against the world, leaving only the dim glow of a single lamp. Your body grows heavier, your thoughts more spacious, the edges of wakefulness loosening as though untied. The Victorians search desperately for rest in their age of iron and smoke. You search in an age of light and glass, but here together across time you share the same simple truth. The night asks you not to conquer it, but to surrender, to let go. So as the last words slip into quiet, imagine yourself safe beneath layers of blankets, the air cool, and still the hum of the world receding. Sleep waits not as an enemy, but as a gentle tide drawing you slowly into its embrace. Let the story go now, let the night carry you.